This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Recently, a viewer on my channel reached out to me and asked if I could put together a video sharing my photo editing workflow from start to finish with one of my landscape images. And I thought that sounded like a good idea because I haven't made a video like this in a very long time. I can't remember the last time I made one of these. This is an image that I bracketed. I bracketed my exposure. I use the exposure bracketing mode in the camera. And so we have this image here, this exposure, then we have one over, and then we have one under. So in Lightroom Classic, I combine them together to make an HDR image, which is what you're seeing here. And then I made some small adjustments to it. First of all, I use the Provia standard film profile because I shoot with a Fujifilm camera and I love the look of the Provia profile, so I use that. I dropped the exposure of this image because you can see it's the whole histogram is leaning pretty far to the right. So I pulled that down in order to create a more balanced histogram where everything is sitting in the middle. I pulled my highlights all the way down in order to recover as much color as I could in the sky. I boosted the shadows a little bit. I added a little bit of a bump in the tone curve to the midtones just to brighten up the mids a little bit. And that is pretty much it. Okay, so the first thing I did was adjust the white balance of the image to ensure that that the colors in my image were accurate. This is not something you have to do with an image. Sometimes it can actually produce worse results, quite honestly, especially if you have an image which has a strong color cast and you want that color cast in the image. You don't have to, fix the white balance in it if you don't want to. But for this particular image, it made a difference. I'm just toggling this on and off. Just a very slight, small difference. It made the yellows and the oranges look a little more correct. The neutrals also aren't quite as blue as they were before. I mean, you could, of course, do this in Lightroom or Camera Raw if you want to, but I'm using a curve here and this midpoint eyedropper here to select an area in the image which is neutral. And this is something I covered in another video here on my channel. I will link to that up here above if you want to check that out and learn how to do that. Okay, the next thing I did was soften the contrast in the image by adding an invert adjustment layer. And let me just go ahead and turn this on and off so you can see the change that is happening. This is an adjustment layer. It's just a basic invert adjustment layer set to an overlay blend mode with a low opacity of 15. Now, this is the kind of thing that you can raise and lower however much you want. If you watch the histogram over there on the right, see how it's like being pushed in when I go up with my opacity, and it gets a little bit further apart when I go all the way down to 0. So that's with no change at all. And when I just raise this a little bit, it's just pushing everything inward some. And this is just a really simple way to be pulling your tonal values closer together, to be pulling those brights and those highlights down, and to be giving a little extra lift to the shadows and the blacks, again, with the goal of just creating a better baseline image. Then I drop the exposure of the image using a tone curve adjustment. And you may notice when I toggle this on and off, the image does get darker, but it gets darker around this area here because I felt like this was already dark enough. And I want to draw the viewer's eye to that area of the image. I don't need to be lowering the exposure there. I want everything else around it to come down. So effectively what I'm doing here is dodging an area of the image by burning everything around it. Okay, the next layer up that I have is a clarity adjustment layer for the background. It is a curve with a negative, like it's just a curve that's been flipped around, a negative adjustment with a soft light blend mode and my opacity set to 20. Whatever is off in the distance, whatever is far away from you, it typically has lower clarity. It has lower contrast. You aren't able to see as much tonality or detail in those far off areas. Obviously, I'm using a mask here that I painted in. I tried to be kind of careful around the rock here because that was a pretty important area. So, like any mask, white reveals, black conceals. So this mask is having no effect on the foreground or around my subject here. It is primarily focused on this area. So let me just toggle this on and off really quick. So that is before and that is after back there in the background. Before, after. Very subtle, not a huge change. If I really wanted to, I could make this contrast even softer. I could also brighten this up a little bit, which I did here, added a little bit of brightness. It's almost like it's kind of like a negative dehaze is basically what it is. See how much more atmospheric it now feels because it has that lower contrast. It just feels nicer, to me at least, than this, which kind of makes things rather muddled. Everything is just kind of like stacking on top of one another. Okay, next up, another tone curve adjustment here. You can see I'm just basically pulling the mids down a little bit and then pulling the shadows down a fair bit down here in the deeper, darker shadows, because this was shot at twilight after all, not in the middle of the day, so it kind of needs that kind of moody feel to it. Next up, I have a selective color adjustment here, and let's see what's going on in here. I think this was a neutrals adjustment. Yeah, it was. I am a big fan of the selective color adjustment layer. I think it's a really powerful tool. And just by selecting your neutrals here and then bumping up your black can really help add a little extra density to the pixels in your image, to the neutrals in your image, and just gives them like almost like a little bit of a boost, a little more color. And it darkens down the midtones a little bit as well. So it's kind of a 2-for-1 adjustment. Okay, then one up from that, I have a highlights adjustment. Now, this is that invert adjustment layer that you saw earlier when we were lowering the contrast in the image. But with this, I'm setting it to a divide blend mode and dropping the fill down to 15%. And let me just raise and lower this so you can see what happens. Does a very good job for whatever reason, this divide blend mode, raising those brightest pixels in the image and doing it really easily and quickly. All right, next up is a color balance adjustment. And with this, I just wanted to take a little bit of the green out. I use a color balance adjustment layer here, set to midtones, added a little bit of red, removed a little bit of green. Oftentimes just 1 or 2 points in this tool make a pretty big difference. Next up, we have brightness and contrast. Now, I think I was probably at this phase starting to feel like maybe things were getting a little too dark and I needed to, give everything a quick boost. Well, oftentimes I find this brightness and contrast tool, just a really simple and quick way to do that without having to apply like a cumbersome tone curve or anything like that. And that's pretty much it. So it's just giving a little more volume to the light, pulling things up a little bit more. So that is where we started, and that is where we are now. And we got to this point almost entirely by adjusting the curves, by adjusting the brightness, adjusting the contrast, making some very small adjustments to the white balance, to just, a little bit of color balancing, a little bit of tweaking, just to remove some of that green and get the tint better, get it more accurate. Otherwise, that is pretty much it. That's all that's really been done to this image. And this is really like the end point for the technical side of the edit. Like, I feel like I've brought it closer to reality, closer to what it was that I saw when I was actually out there taking this image at twilight. And I now have a better baseline image to be doing additional creative edits with, and I can be layering more on top of this. So if you would like to check out the finished version of this landscape image and many other landscape images of mine as well, you can do so by heading over to Dominey.photography. I'll put the URL down here below, which brings us to the sponsor of today's video, Squarespace. I like using Squarespace to publish my photography because I don't have to do any coding. I don't need to, set up a website myself on my own web server or anything like that, or hire a web developer. Squarespace handles everything for me. It's all browser-based. I just simply sign in, I upload my images, I group and categorize them however I want. And Squarespace has many templates for you to choose from when you sign up. But if you're not sure what kind of look you're going for and you want Squarespace to recommend something for you, they have a whole new AI system that you can use. You just tell Squarespace what it is that you're trying to do with your website, what your goals are, what type of content you are producing, which colors and typefaces you prefer, and Squarespace will build an entirely new website for you from scratch, which you can then jump in and start editing with your own content. So if you need a new website for your photography, a small business, your side hustle, whatever it is that you're trying to do, whatever you need a website for, head over to squarespace.com/Dominey. Sign up for a free 30-day trial. It's not going to cost you a thing, no credit card required. And then whenever you're ready to go live, use my last name as the coupon code to save 10% off a new website or domain. Okay, so let's keep going here. And at this point of the edit, I have a good foundation, a good baseline, one that I could return to later on if I want to. This is a good place to begin turning the corner towards making more localized adjustments to the image, begin to do a little more brush work, a little more dodging and burning, more selective adjustments to the image, ones in which, I could easily undo and roll back to this state here and be perfectly happy with this as a new starting point. And the first adjustment that I made here, I added a high pass filter. Now I can tell that I was definitely rounding the corner here and starting to get a little more detail because I was adding high pass. Now high pass is a way of bringing out the details in your image. If you've never used it before, I'll just do a quick demonstration for you here. You want to come up here. Well, first you need a rasterized layer to be working from. Then you just come up here to filter, you go to other, you choose high pass, and then you want to choose a pixel radius, which is appropriate for the resolution of your camera. Typically, the lower the resolution of your camera is, the lower you set the radius. So for example, like with my Canon R5, I would set this to like 1.5, 2 pixels, something like that. But with a higher megapixel camera, like my Fujifilm GFX, that oftentimes requires either 4 or 4.5 or 5 or something like that. It's adding some micro contrast to the details and to the textures in the image. It's adding a little bit of brightening to one side of an edge and a little bit of darkening to the other in order to better reveal and make those textures like stand up a little bit more. So then you just click on OK. You change the layer blend mode to overlay. And as long as you keep it simple and not go too aggressive with this, just a small little adjustment there, that is a good way to help bring out the details and the textures in your image a little bit without creating halos or without creating problems later when you are exporting the image, you're sharpening the image either to make a print or sharpening it for your website. Honestly, I should have done this high pass adjustment at the very end of the edit. That is typically when you do sharpening and things. Honestly, I may delete this and add it back later on. So I recommend doing that at the very end. Now you may notice here that there is a mask applied to it. Not a particularly refined mask. All I really did here was just add a black mask and then I painted white over the areas where I wanted that high pass filter effect to be applied. Next up, I did a little bit of dodging and burning here and I used the TK9 plugin here to do this. But this is just really simple to do on your own. All it is just a 50% gray background for my layer here. And I used a black brush set to a low opacity. And I just did a little bit of burning onto this little bit of grass here because the highlight on it I felt was rather strong and rather distracting. So I took that down a little bit, use a hue saturation layer here. I dropped the saturation and increased the lightness and then grouped it inside of a group and just painted the effect in with a white brush and a black mask, exactly where I wanted it to be on top of this rather annoying little bit of grass here. Okay, next up, I have an invert layer with a black mask and some white paint on it. And let me look at this. And I think this is this is just a little bit of a highlight adjustment here that I've applied. The invert layer, similar to what I showed you before, when set to a blend mode of divide, and you can adjust the fill to suit to taste, that lifts the highlights in your image. And then I use this black mask with a white brush here in order to paint in that effect where I wanted it to be. So I wanted to enhance the glow on the outside of this rock here. So I just used that layer, that invert layer with the blend mode set to divide, and then painted the effect in where I wanted it to be. Now I think there are some other areas here too. Yeah, some other little highlights on like some of the rocks and things in the background. Okay, next up we have a selective color adjustment for the sky, and I can tell it's the sky by looking at the mask here. There is the sky mask that I have, and this was created by Photoshop. It has sky selection built into it. Let's see here. If we take a look at the sky, I think what I was probably doing was, I was removing more of the yellow from the sky and making it look a little more, bring a little more red into it, a little more magenta to better match the appearance of twilight and get, try and reinforce that twilight feeling. And this was just a really small adjustment, neutrals and selective color, +4 for magenta, just added a little bit of magenta there in order to pull some of that green out. And by the way, this sky edit here is an excellent example of learning how to see the undertones in a hue. It is something that it's a skill that I know that I've been working on. I've been trying to, improve my own eye for, because I feel like it's the key to successful color edits in general. Because if you don't understand the colors which are being mixed together to create the hues that you see on screen, remember that every pixel is comprised of red, green, and blue, right? So there are multiple colors at play there. And if you want to get a color from, point A to point B, you have to be able to see the colors in there. You have to see that undertone and know how to shift it in order to get it to where you want to go. So for example, I added a little bit of magenta in order to get rid of the green. I made a whole video actually about learning how to see undertones. And if you're interested in that, I'll put that up here so you can check it out after this. Next up, I did a slight burn down here to the bottom of the image. You'll see that it's a little bit bright on the edge here. The value of this is really similar to this up here. I don't want it to be too distracting. For some reason, this was just feeling rather distracting to me. And just adding a little bit of a burn there, a little bit of a black brush with that soft light blend mode on that layer, just really helped, push that down and further emphasize my subject here. Next up, a little bit of a brightness contrast adjustment. Photo editing is, like I said earlier, it's kind of like an accordion. Sometimes you push things in, you pull things out, and you move around, and I was probably getting worried that it was too dark. And then next up, I added just a slight vignette, just to kind of darken the corners a little bit. Not necessary, it just helps bring a little more focus to the center of the image. Okay, the next edit that I made was pulling some of the blue out of the image. Blue has a tendency to feel rather dark and rather heavy because we perceive it to be a dark hue. Okay, so that's with it off. And you can see how the shadows and things down in here, they're getting a little bluish. They're reflecting a little bit of that ambient light. And there's also a big patch of blue up here in the sky, which I don't really care for. If we zoom the image out and look at it, see how noticeable that blue is up there? It really doesn't look all that great. So I could have done a sky mask here and just targeted the blues up there, but instead I chose to pull down the blues throughout the entire image, which also helps simplify the color palette of the image, which again can help further support and emphasize your subject, because the less information there is in the image, and when I say information, I mean detail and texture and shapes and lines and, colors, another layer on top of that. And when the colors in your image are really complex and you have, all these different hues in there, the image can begin to feel noisy and it can begin to feel rather complex and heavy because there's just a bunch of things going on. Okay, then I added a little bit of dodging up there in the upper right-hand corner in order to further help push down those blues. And I just painted some white paint onto here until I got a good blend, until I was able to blend, this together and make it look better. So again, that was where it was before, and it may be better to look at it from a distance a little bit. That is where it was before, and that was with my blue adjustment. So just pulling some of that blue out of the sky. The next step is rather interesting. I forgot that I did this, but this was something that I did here in order to bring more shape and dimension to the light, to better support the light in the scene. Because as you can see over here on the horizon, this is where the light was. It was out of frame over here to the right side, and it was raking across the desert landscape here. And so what I wanted to do here was to make just a slight adjustment to the light in the image so that it felt more like the light was coming from an angle over there, but without being really heavy-handed with it, without doing sun rays or some kind of bright orange glow or whatever. I just wanted to add a little bit of shape and dimension to the light. And so I've raised the opacity. I've made it so that you're able to see what's going on here. Basically what I did was I added a gradient fill here, and I used black at one end, black at the other end, and then I put white in the middle. and I adjusted its angle just a little bit so that it's dark up here in the sky. It gets brighter here in the middle at just a very slight angle, and then dark again down here, just to bring a little more contour, in other words, to the light in the image. And again, that's with a gradient fill, and I set the blend mode to overlay in order to create that contrast. That is what the overlay blend mode does. That's what soft light does. It darkens the pixels underneath black, and it brightens the pixels underneath white in the gradient. And then I can just use the opacity here, to suit to taste. And actually, let me go back in my history here just to make sure that I get the right opacities. Okay, so that's where we were before. I had to overlay blend mode, 46% opacity, very subtle adjustment. Just a little bit of toning, just a little bit of extra dimension being added here to the light. Next up, we have a burn layer. Now, this is another example of further enhancing your subject by pushing other elements down, by burning distractions in your image. And this area here was definitely causing some distractions for me. You can see how bright this area is. And it just kind of, your eye just goes right to this area here. So I used a luminosity mask with a black brush, blend mode set to soft light. I painted some black into this area here and just tried to be really careful with my adjustment and push this down so that it wasn't quite as bright as it was before, which just helps, it just creates more balance in the image. It doesn't feel like, one area is kind of like sticking out and one area is being louder than the other. Okay, let's keep going. Added just a little bit of vibrance to the image. Just bring a little more life, a little more color into those pixels with low and medium levels of saturation. And then I did a little more toning work here again with the light by pushing the exposure down a bit and then adding a curve adjustment on top of that in order to bring even more contrast into the image. So that is where we were before, and that is with that little extra contrast added. Okay, then next up we have a color balance adjustment. Now I like to use color balance towards the end of an edit. I mean, of course it can be used earlier when doing corrective work, when doing technical work, but color balance is also a really nice way just to add a little extra sweetening to an image, to the colors in your image, to make some small adjustments to your shadows, to your midtones, to your highlights, just to give them a little more character and a little more personality. And I think what I was trying to do here was add a little more warmth to the midtones in the image, because this is at dusk after all. And I didn't want the mids to feel quite as neutral as they did before. So I bumped up my reds a little bit and I pulled some blue out as well in order to create more warmth in the midtones. I did the same thing in the highlights here in order to make the highlights just a little bit warmer. And in the shadows, I added a little bit of magenta. Sometimes that can be a really effective way to further enhance the warmth of a golden hour image like this, is to push a little bit of red or maybe some magenta, pull some of those cooler hues out of the shadows, add some warm hues into there, because then it feels more like that orange light is wrapping around and is bouncing around and is filling in some of those darks, some of those shadows and blacks in your image. Okay, then next up I added just a little bit of punch, a little bit of extra light into the middle of the image here, and it's very slight. So let me increase the opacity so we're able to see it more effectively. So basically all this is a curve layer with a screen blend mode assigned to it, and screen makes pixels brighter. And then I applied an oval mask here with, white obviously, revealing and black concealing around the corners. It's kind of like a reverse vignette effect is another way to think of it. And I set this really low, like down to like 5% kind of a thing. And, this is the kind of thing that you can, adjust however you want. You could actually just jump into Adobe Camera Raw from here and, put a radial gradient on top of your image. Okay, then finally I brushed in just a little bit of an adjustment down here into this area, just to bring up the lights a little bit down here to create more balance with the right side of the image over here, because I felt like it needed something to kind of counterbalance this. And it's not much. It's a very small, very slight adjustment. But at the end of the day, it's the sum of all those small little adjustments that you've been making here and there that's important. All right, so there we have it. That is the final version of the image there. And this is where we started. Pretty big difference between the two, right? And I can tell you without question that this image here feels much more similar, much closer to what I remember seeing, what I remember feeling and experiencing when I was out there in the desert in New Mexico taking this image. The digital cameras that we shoot with today are exceptionally good at creating a neutral, unbiased image. I mean, they are very clinical. Camera companies, and lens manufacturers, they've been working for years and years and years in order to effectively make their camera lenses more neutral, sharper, clearer, less flare, less glow, less diffusion, less diffraction and chromatic aberration and all that kind of stuff. They're becoming more and more and more sterile. And this is honestly like one of my favorite types of edits to do, because I don't feel like it has I don't feel like the finished version of it here has diverged all that greatly from the original. I mean, obviously it does look rather different, but everything that makes the image what it is was, primarily captured in camera, including the highlights on the, the side of the rocks here, the highlights on, all these little like shavings of rock here, which I think are just beautiful. Like it almost looks like a star field or something. Little glint of light on the side of this rock over here. Obviously, the grass as well. Good color in the sky. I totally did not fake the highlight on the side of this rock here either. All it needed was just a little nudging and a little bit of pushing in order to shape and mold what was already there and get it into a good place. That for me is just so satisfying. Like the fewer the number of edits that I need to make to an image, and the closer it is to what the camera, originally captured, the better. Like, then I feel like I'm doing it right. Like I'm capturing the best possible image that I can get in camera, and I am tastefully applying edits and changes in order to make, the most of the image and create the best version of that image without going nuts and without, making huge sweeping changes to the image. The fewer edits, the better. It's kind of like golf or something. It's like one way to think of it. It's like, fewer the strokes you have, the higher your score and the better your game. So that is, that's one way to think of it. If this video was helpful and you got something out of it, or if you were at least entertained by it for a little bit, please do me a favor, give this video a thumbs up down below. I would greatly appreciate it. Every like, every thumbs up that a video gets really does help expose a video to other people, and which is more important than ever before with the YouTube algorithm. And it's definitely something you could do to help me out, and I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you for being here. Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video, and I will see you in the next one.